Hello friends, welcome to Panchshala. I'm Shagun Sharma. I work as an assistant professor in political science in Government College for Girls, Sector 42, Chandigarh. The paper is Foreign Policy of India, and the module I'm going to discuss today is India's foreign policy, historical background, objectives and principles. Foreign policy is a set of principles and objectives which a country needs in conducting its relations with other countries. Every country needs a set of foreign policy principles so that it can maintain its relations with other countries at international level. So, foreign policy is a set of behavior through which one country can try to exert pressure on another country. Moreover, a foreign policy can be in continuity and it can also be changed at times. Foreign policy has both positive as well as negative dimensions. It is positive when it tries to change the behavior of other country, whereas it is negative when it does not try any effort to change the behavior of other country. Therefore, foreign policy of India is dependent on various internal as well as external factors. Moreover, India's foreign policy is also based on certain principles like Panchsheel, peaceful coexistence and non-alignment. At the same time, it also has certain objectives. Through this module, an effort will be made to apprise the students about the origin and working of India's foreign policy. It is a well-known fact that a country's foreign policy does not evolve all of a sudden. Rather, it is a product of numerous factors and forces. India is no exception to this phenomenon. Therefore, it becomes imperative to understand and evaluate the historical perspective about the origin of its foreign policy. Besides, it is also essential to know about the major objectives of the policy as to ascertain the trends and working of its foreign affairs. But these objectives are not always manifested. As a result, to know the real intent of the working of foreign policy, one has to understand the broader policy framework. For this, knowledge of major principles of governing foreign policy is to be deciphered. This may help to understand not only the day-to-day affairs of the state with the outside world, but a long-term foreign policy also. Historical perspective. Foreign policy of any country to great extent is determined by the specific nature of external and internal environment. Besides, the history, legacies, personality, ideologies, structural setup, etc. also influence the foreign policy of a country. India's foreign policy development is no exception to this fact. Multiple factors have contributed towards the finalization of different goals and principles of its foreign policy. Hence, to study the impact of historical background on India's foreign policy becomes imperative, as this has deep impact on the foreign policy making over the years. In this context, Nehru was right when he observed that it should not be inferred that India has started working as a state all of a sudden. Rather, its long past, contemporary history and freedom movement have formed its ideals. Ideological moorings. Indian foreign policy is considered to be the byproduct of two dominant ideological streams prevalent in its culture. These important traditions have been traditions based on friendship, cooperation, peace and non-violence developed by the thinkers of ancient India, that is Gautam Buddha, and modern India, that is Mahatma Gandhi. They considered that means and ends are equally important and should be pure to attain any objective. Another tradition gave importance to realism and power, influenced by the ideas of Western thinkers Machiavelli and developed by Indian thinker Kautilya. It did not bother about the means, rather ends, justify the means that has been its main motto. Out of these two traditions, however, India adhered to the first one, which primarily governed the foreign policy moorings of the country. International status. As far as the international identity is concerned, India got a solid result as it signed the Covenant of League and Charter of United Nations as primary members. In the English Empire, 3 self-ruled dominions were there with whom it used to have consultations on matters of foreign affairs on the basis of 1817 Colonial Conference. These dominions were Canada, Australia and South Africa, but India had not been given this right. During the First World War, India supported British like other dominions with the hope that it would get some status of foreign affairs as was being given to other such states. As a result, India got permission to join in Colonial Conference in 1917. Thus, for the first time, India got membership of international organization in 1917. In the same year, the name of this conference had been changed from Colonial Conference to Imperial Conference, which was later changed into English Commonwealth. Anyhow, this has opened the gates for the entry of colonial India to participate in international conferences. Consequently, in 1945, at San Francisco as well, India joined the UN as primary member. Thus, India has already acquired international identity even prior to its independence. Role of Indian National Congress. Congress also contributed to a great deal for the evolution of the process of foreign policy making in India. It starts playing an important role in this direction since World War I. In 1921, All India Congress Committee's session in New Delhi is considered to be the landmark in the history of India's foreign relations. In 1925, Congress authorized All India Congress Committee to open a foreign department with Jawaharlal Nehru at its head. But this department could not achieve something substantial during the period 1930 to 1934, as most of the leaders were busy in public movement or in jails. It could get importance again only after Nehru got elected as President of Congress in Lucknow session in 1936. In May 1936, under the leadership of Ram Manohar Lohia, the Office of Foreign Department was established in All India National Congress office. Within 6 months of its existence, it contacted nearly 400 persons and institutions to formulate foreign policy. Besides, Congress started regularly releasing press notes and bulletins on all important international issues. Probably, as a result of huge network of Congress Foreign Policy Department, Jawaharlal Nehru was able to give a detailed and comprehensive blueprint of independent India's foreign policy in his maiden radio broadcast on 7 September 1946 as Vice President of Interim Government. Criticism of colonialism. Congress always condemned the policy of colonialism and imperialism. At its very first session in 1885, Congress had passed a resolution deprecating the annexation of Upper Burma to the Indian Empire. In 1892, through another resolution, it disassociated and made itself free from the imperial policy of Britain. In 1920, by sending the sympathy message to the people of Ireland for their struggle for freedom, Congress confirmed its attitude of support towards freedom struggle against colonialism. During the World War II, India was critical of British imperialistic policies in general, along with their particular response towards it. Congress also criticized the UN Charter through its Working Committee resolution in July 1945. Two major objections of the Congress were: one, against the dominant role of the great powers in the new organization to the extent that they are placed above and beyond the law, and second, against the vague and unsatisfactory declaration in the Charter about non-self-governing territories. Unattached to the British policies, Congress time and again declared itself unattached to the British policies and proclaimed that the latter's policies has nothing to do with the ideas of Congress. In 1892, the Congress objected to the British policies to use India as a base for political maneuvering or military moves against surrounding areas such as Tibet, Burma, Afghanistan, and Persia. In 1921, for the first time in its All India Congress Committee meeting in Delhi, it declared through a journal resolution that the present environment of India in no way represents Indian opinion. Besides, it also declared that its neighbors not at all threaten India. Support for backward nations. Congress exhibited great interest for the unity and rise of backward and colonial states of Asia. In 1920, in Baku city of Kazakhstan, in the erstwhile USSR, when a conference of Asian states was convened, India was one of the 19 countries called for such conference. In 1926 and 1927, such conferences were organized in Japan and China respectively. India also participated in them. Main aim of such meetings was to end the European colonialism in Asia. It resulted in the convening of Brussels Conference on 10th February 1927. Convening of Asian countries meetings in New Delhi in 1947 and 1949 were proofs of such commitment. Independent India's foreign policy, thus, has been marked by the impacts of legacies of British rule, experiences of freedom movement, role of leaders during freedom struggle, etc. These factors, along with the changing national and international milieu, have given birth to major objectives and principles of India's foreign policy. Objectives of India's foreign policy are aimed at to fulfill the national interests of that state. India is no exception to this phenomenon. A depth analysis reveals that generally a consensus is found on the national interests in the country, but it may not always be necessary all the time. National security. For any country, national security and territorial integrity used to be the prime concern and main objective for it. Making a comparative assessment of the three primary objectives, it has rightly been observed that security is the first guarantee of a state's international personality. National development is its categorical imperative. Ordered pattern of international relations is a minimum preconditions for its independent existence and free development. In case of India, to a great extent, security includes both traditional and non-traditional threat concerns. It also includes independent decision-making on international issues, opposition to military alliances, friendly relations with neighbors, and opposition to policies of colonialism and imperialism. Besides, India has been a staunch critic of outside intervention and Cold War. It is in favor of judging foreign policy issues on the merit of the case. Consequently, its policy of non-alignment represents its freedom, security, and sovereignty. Economic development. For a developing country like India, Rapid economic development naturally becomes a significant determinant of its foreign policy. In this context, first of all, it has to develop its power potentials, which is dependent on three important variables. One, population, second, natural resources, and third, technology. Later on, the pattern of growth in India has to be determined in terms of its constitutional limitations, role of state, and ideology of economic development. These domestic factors need to be coordinated with outside world through foreign policy. Thus, it is inevitable for India to enhance its per capita income and gross domestic product to make it available for spending more in the areas of its defense. Besides, through diplomacy, it has to stop the recurrence of wars, and through United Nations, it had to get the rules framed against the warfare. Moreover, it has to strengthen economic cooperation with outside world through the activities of foreign aid, capital investments, joint ventures, trade, etc. Therefore, India, since its inception, has been a supporter of getting the IMF and World Bank loans and aids from the developed world. It has also approved the enhancement of bilateral technology transfer in vital areas of its economy. Probably, this might have been the reason for India's insistence for the establishment of new international economic order since 1970s. It is also a supporter of present organizations like World Trade Organization, World Order. Foreign policy of a country works in a particular international milieu. Major task of any country's foreign policy is to fulfill its national interest by making a favorable world order. That is why Jawaharlal Nehru visualized the working of foreign policy in a larger global order. India has been supporter of policy of disarmament in the context of threat from the nuclear explosion. Similarly, it opposed Cold War politics in the larger interest of the requirement of the peace for the developing countries. India was very much vocal on the issues like freedom of colonies, opposition to colonialism, imperialism and racialism, opposition to power blocks, strengthening the United Nations, complete disarmament, world peace, etc. Later on, economic issues acquired prominence over political factors. Consequently, India became the main supporter of the demand for new international economic order. During the Cold War and post-Cold War eras, India on the one hand has been making efforts for the establishment of new international economic order, while on the other hand striking hard for the creation of nuclear-free world. Thus, during the last more than 6 decades, India has been instrumental in creating an equalitarian and just world order to fulfill its national interests. Opposition to colonialism, imperialism, and racialism. Struggle against colonialism, imperialism, and racialism has been the leading ideological currents in Indian foreign policy. Based on India's own experiences with Soviet, in the post-independence era, India supported the cause of anti-imperialism in the context of other such nations. India opposed all such policies of other such countries within the United Nations and outside this forum. Besides, India has been ardent critic of the policy of apartheid in South Africa. Beginning from Gandhi's movement and coming of Nelson Mandela to power, it has been continuously criticizing the functioning of racial regimes in South Africa. Besides, India has always felt concerned about the economic development of the nations in the African continent. Rajiv Gandhi's efforts towards the setting up of an Africa Fund is a clear example of India's such foreign policy orientation. Supporter of disarmament. India has been striving hard for disarmament through United Nations and other such forums. It had introduced numerous resolutions or amendments to resolutions introduced by other states in the United Nations to achieve the aim of general and complete disarmament. It has taken active part in the 18 Nations Committee on Disarmament, which was created by the General Assembly in 1961 and opened in Geneva on 14th May 1962 and has been functioning ever since. In 1963, India not only initiated but also signed the Moscow Test Ban Treaty or Partial Test Ban Treaty. Later on, through the 26 Nations Conference of the Committee on Disarmament and Non-Alignment Movement, India facilitated the process of the indoctrination of Non-Proliferation Treaty. However, due to its non-universal and discriminatory nature, India did not sign its final shape and started the demand for the conclusion of a comprehensive test ban treaty. Consequently, in December 1993, India and the United States of America jointly sponsored the CTBT. While presenting this treaty, India put two conditions. It should be universal and it should be aimed towards complete disarmament. But due to not fulfillment of these twin objectives in the final shape of this treaty, India refused to sign the same. But still, India is ready to sign any such treaty based on above two objectives and non-discriminatory in its nature. Important role in Asia. One central point of India's foreign policy has been to play an important role in Asia. Due to its history, cultural legacy, area, geographical conditions, etc., its ruling elite perceived an important role for India in this region. Even during freedom movement, it raised the grievances of these states along with its own concerns. A resolution passed by the first session of the Congress in 1885 deprecated the annexation of Upper Burma by the British is proof of such interests of India. Besides, it participated in the important conferences convened to discuss the problems of Asia. For instance, it took part in 1920 Asian Conference in Kazakhstan along with 19 other nations. Not only this, even before its independence, it convened a conference of Asian states in New Delhi from 23rd March to 2nd April 1947. Later on, second such conference was called in New Delhi in 1949 on Indonesian question. Thus, India always made efforts to play a significant role in Asia. Afro-Asian Regional Cooperation. Since its inception, India is making serious efforts to bring out cooperation among the states of Asia and Africa. During Cold War era, this effort has mainly been limited to political dimension. After covering of Asian Conference in 1947 and 1949, India was also instrumental in bringing about unity and cooperation among Afro-Asian Conference at Bandung in 1955. Finally, non-aligned movement was established from the majority of its membership from Asian and African nations. In the post-Cold War era, economic dimensions acquired prominence in the development of Afro-Asian cooperation. First, through the SAARC, an effort is being made to develop free trade area. Second, by developing cooperation between SAARC and ASEAN, it wants to extend the area of cooperation in whole Asia. Finally, by creating a 14-member, which has now reached to 20, Indian Ocean Rim Association for Regional Cooperation on 6th March 1997, India is entrusted to create cooperation among the countries of Asia, Africa and Indian Ocean littorals. Faith in United Nations. One of the essential aims of India's foreign policy has been its quest for peace through the United Nations. India's deep commitment towards this body can be seen from its joining of the United Nations as primary member even prior to its freedom. India considered it as the only hope for peaceful cooperation among nations. That is why it never wavered in its support to this body, even when it felt disappointed with the treatment meted out to it by the UN in respect of Kashmir and other such issues. India took keen interest in all kinds of activities of the United Nations. By giving prime importance to peace in its foreign policy, it has indirectly contributed to strengthen the foundation of the United Nations. Despite its poverty, it has always paid its contribution to the United Nations in time. It has also contributed its forces for the UN peacekeeping activities. Protection of overseas Indian. Protection of the interests of the overseas Indians has been an important objective of India's foreign policy. Basically, overseas Indian could be categorized into three groups. Number one, Indian citizens staying abroad for an indefinite period for whatever purpose, such as employment or business, whether on their own or on special governmental assignments or working in international organizations. They have been clearly defined as non-resident Indians in the FERA 1973. Second, people who were forced to immigrate to different parts of the British Empire. Now the descendants of those migrants who are called people of Indian origin. And finally, people who are legally and technically branded as stateless persons of Indian origin. India's policy towards them has been twofold. For those who have adopted the nationality of the country in which they are living, India has no political concern with them, though it would continue to have sentimental concern for them. For them, Government of India won't ask for special privileges, but where any unfair treatment is given to them, of course it is bound to react. In case of NRIs, government is willing to extend all kinds of cooperation. Some of them have recently been provided double citizenship. These steps are being taken with the expectation that they will greatly contribute towards the economic and technological development of India. Principles of India's foreign policy. To fulfill the above objective of India's foreign policy is governed by certain principles. Principles, on the one hand, provide rational analysis of foreign policy, and on the other hand, they represent continuity in foreign affairs. The principles governing India's foreign policy are as under. Number one, non-alignment. Most important and central focus of India's foreign policy is its principle of non-alignment. Basically, India's policy of non-alignment has been deprived from twofold sources, material and non-material. The two key material mainsprings are geopolitical and economic in character. Among the non-material sources, prominent are historical legacies and philosophy tradition of the country. Non-alignment has numerous dimensions, but usually it is considered to be a policy related to Cold War. In other words, it is considered to be a policy not to participate in the military alliances systems raised out of Cold War period. Besides, India regarded it as a principle having independent outlook in global politics. It is a policy which provides India an opportunity to act independently on world problems without any pressures from the so-called superpowers. This policy of independence of choice was first determined by national interest and then by merit of the issue and the world situation. Some Western observers often confuse this policy with the terms like isolationism, non-commitment, etc. But these concepts are in no way similar to that of the non-alignment. For instance, neutrality as policy of non-commitment had limited use during war times, whereas policy of non-alignment is applied both in times of war and peace. Moreover, these days it is not easy to remain neutral in world affairs. Thus, India cannot remain neutral where freedom, justice and aggression are involved. Similarly, comparison of non-alignment with that of the concepts of isolationism is also unwarranted. It is because isolationism is not possible in the contemporary world. Therefore, India's policy of non-alignment is considered in a positive manner as the policy related to development of goodwill and economic cooperation among different states. It is because on the basis of such cooperation, the realization of the ideal of one world can be achieved. Non-alignment, therefore, is a multi-dimensional policy having both its positive and negative aspects. It was not a policy of non-calent, rather a dynamic policy which changes according to the changes that take place in the international milieu. Panchsheel. Ethical and peaceful dimensions of India's foreign policy are also reflected through its policy of Panchsheel, which means 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. These principles were first enunciated in the preamble of trade agreement signed between India and China on 29th April 1955. Later on, these were reiterated in a joint statement issued during the visit of China's Premier Zhou Enlai to India on 28th June 1954. 5 principles of Panchsheel are mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, non-aggression, non-interference in each other's domestic affairs, equality and mutual benefits, and peaceful coexistence. These principles are not only related to India's policy towards China, but also a declared policy towards other neighbors and rest of the world. Though a question mark has been put on the use of this principle by the 1962 Sino-Indian War, yet India did not give up its faith in such policy. Rather, with the improvement in India-China relations during the contemporary post-Cold War era, faith in these principles has again been reiterated. Dynamism and adaptability. India's foreign policy, apart from being a dynamic policy, has the capacity to adapt itself to international changes. For instance, non-alignment did not mean that India always opposed the receipt of military assistances. Rather, it had accepted such aid and assistance whenever national interests demanded so. For instance, it accepted America's military assistance during 1962 crisis. Conclusion of military-to-military cooperation in the Asia-Pacific in the post-Cold War era in 1991 is another illustration of India's such flexible approach. Besides, to give military assistance to Bangladesh, Maldives and Sri Lanka during the period of crisis are additional proofs of such changing stance. It was due to this dynamic nature, India's foreign policy has well adapted to the changing international milieu. Moreover, from the Cold Warrior bloc politics of 1950s and 1960s to that of quite opposite world found in the post-Cold War era, India has been successfully meeting out its divergent foreign policy challenges due to its flexible orientations. During these decades, India has made itself capable enough to handle the crisis like 4 major wars with neighbors, non-proliferation and missile technology development obstacles, and economic regionalism. Peaceful coexistence. Finally, the principle of peaceful coexistence also constitutes one of the principles of India's foreign policy. Though it is constituent of India's principle of Panchsheel, yet in a more comprehensive manner, it represents the overall cultural ethos of live and let others live of India's tradition. In one more sense, it can be looked as an independent phenomenon to that of Panchsheel, as the latter does not recognize the divisibility of world on the basis of ideology and believe in the philosophy of friendship with all countries. Moreover, in terms of military alliances, it does not prevent the states to form or join any group beyond such blocs. Despite criticisms of Cold Warrior blocs of capitalism and communism, it did not prevent the states from forging closer economic, social, cultural and scientific cooperation with the countries of these blocs. Hence, it believes in the cooperation and friendship among all the countries of the world for the growth of peace and development around the globe. Now, to conclude this module, we can say that foreign policy of India is determined by various historical backgrounds. These historical backgrounds give result to objectives of foreign policy, and these objectives give rise to foreign policy principles. Talking about the historical backgrounds, there are certain events like formation of Indian National Congress, freedom struggle and leadership. These historical backgrounds gave result to certain objectives. Two important objectives are important, which are world order and national security. Apart from it, there are certain other objectives also which are important, like promotion of Afro-Asian unity, abolition of colonialism, racialism and development of Indian economy. Now, these objectives can be achieved only if we have sound foreign policy principles. These foreign policy principles are Panchsheel and non-alignment. Apart from it, there are certain other principles also like peaceful coexistence, domestic economic factors, etc.